Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things and welcome to another video. And today I have Nick here with me.
Hello.
And we're going to be discussing Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen. So continuing in a Jane Austen July tradition, Nick has read another Jane Austen book this year and we thought we'd make a video about it. So this year Nick's read Northanger Abbey. Shall we give an introduction about what Northanger Abbey is about before we get into very spoilery territory?
The Northanger Abbey tells the story of Catherine Morland, a clergyman's daughter who's taken to Bath by family friends, the Allens. And at Bath she meets two families, the Thorpes and the Tilneys, and hijinks ensue from there.
So, I like Northanger Abbey. It is not my favourite Jane Austen novel. It's probably my least favourite Jane Austen novel, to be honest. Though I do... There are elements about it that I really like.
So what? Despite you.
Yeah. Well, you did. You said which one should you read next, and I told you which of the three you had left. I told you which my favourite one was and what my least favourite one was, and then you went to read my least favourite. But what did you think of Northanger Abbey in general?
So, of the ones that I have read, which are Pride and Prejudice, Mansfield Park, Emma, and now Northanger Abbey, I think I liked Northanger Abbey more than everything except Pride and Prejudice. I think Emma is probably objectively a better book, but Northanger Abbey just clicked with me a bit better than Emma did. But I actually think it's a better book than Mansfield Park.
I mean, you are wrong, but, you know, moving past that, what did you like about Northanger Abbey?
I just thought it was very, very funny, actually, and it's quite different to the other ones that I've read, and as I understand it, most of her other novels.
Yeah, I would say so.
In that it's a sort of fairly extended parody of the Gothic novel. So there's quite a lot of bits in this where Jane Austen, as narrator, makes jokes in a way that I don't think is as common in the other books I've read, and they are very, very funny.
So I would say Northanger Abbey is sort of like in two acts. So the first half, I think, of the book is set in Bath, where Catherine Morland has gone with some family friends, the Allens, kind of for the season and to experience society. And while there, she ends up meeting and being invited to the house of a family called the Tilneys. She ends up going with them back to Northanger Abbey, and the second part of the book is set in Northanger Abbey and looks at her kind of experiences there. And Northanger Abbey is a little bit Gothic, and that's where the kind of Gothic parody element like really comes into its own.
I think it's probably slightly weighted towards Bath, actually. I feel like I'm not sure if the Northanger Abbey bit is actually shorter, but it definitely feels shorter than the Bath section.
Yeah, it's actually interesting that it's titled Northanger Abbey as we know it, because that wasn't Jane Austen's title for it. That was the title her brother Henry gave to it when he published it after her death. It was originally called Susan. We assume that was the original name of Catherine Morland, and then it got changed to Catherine. And at one point in her letters, she refers to it as Miss Catherine. But she didn't actually entitle it Northanger Abbey herself. And actually, I feel like the fact that it's called Northanger Abbey means you spend the whole book waiting for them to get to Northanger Abbey, and you're like focused on Northanger Abbey in a way that you might not have been if it was called something different.
I think that's true, and I think also when you get to Northanger Abbey, there's quite an extended Gothic parody. And having said that, I enjoyed that. This one, despite having some very funny individual like vignettes, actually kind of slows down the pacing and I think gets in the way of the story that Jane Austen's actually telling. And I think it's interesting because I know you've said that she was potentially thinking about revising it before her death and obviously never got around to it. And it does feel like with another revision, some of those elements would have been toned down or maybe even removed completely to focus on the actual sort of relationships between the characters, which I think get completely obscured. In particular, I think Eleanor, we get almost nothing from Eleanor for the whole book, despite the fact that she's supposed to be sort of Catherine's true friend. And
yeah, and obviously she's a much nicer person than Isabella Thorpe, but Isabella Thorpe has a much bigger like presence in the narrative and a much bigger kind of, she feels much more of a character, I would say, than Eleanor does.
yes.
So just if anyone doesn't know about the history of like Northanger Abbey, basically we think Northanger Abbey was one of the first books that Jane Austen wrote around a similar time to Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility, when she was in like her late teens, early 20s, possibly the first one. That has been argued. And then she revised it when she was living in Bath, like when she was, I guess, in her later 20s. Sold it to a publisher for publication under the title of Susan. The publisher bought it, but never ever published it. Later she bought the copyright back, and we know she revised it later in life. There are some references in her letters to her, like, putting it to side for the time being. The suggestion, I think, maybe being that she was going to do some more work on it, but it's hard to tell. And then her brother published it the year after her death. But we don't know whether or not she was finished with it, I suppose. Maybe she was, maybe she wasn't. But I feel like it feels like it could have... I feel like it feels like it could have done with another edit. That's one thing I do always think when I read Northanger Abbey. Enjoy it though I do.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. I think it's difficult because it does read like a transitional work. I know you said that a lot of her juvenilia is quite interested in Gothic and like parody.
Yeah, not necessarily Gothic as much as like sentimental novel stuff, but her juvenilia is like almost entirely parody in the way that Northanger Abbey is very much that too.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting because it feels like those two styles overlap a lot in Northanger Abbey, but also are a bit at war with each other.
Yeah.
And I think actually there's a lot of stuff where Jane Austen's a bit wry about talking about like, well, this is what would happen if this was actually a Gothic novel.
Yeah.
Like there's a bit at the end where Catherine Morland is returning home in disgrace, basically, and she's like, in a Gothic novel, she'd be a countess now and returning home in triumph, but you know, I've done something different.
Yeah.
And there's a great bit right at the end where Henry Tilney has proposed to Catherine, but they haven't yet obtained General Tilney's consent, and she basically just says, the reader's obviously not worried about this because there's only 10 pages left, so you must know that it's all going to work out quite quickly.
Yeah, and there's some bits are really self-conscious. I love the bit earlier where she's like, usually in novels no one reads novels, but my characters, they're reading lots of novels. Like, I really enjoy that bit.
Oh yeah, well she goes off, she rants about authors complaining about novels.
Yeah, who are themselves novel writers, and how actually, you know, Jane Austen is very much in defence of the novel in Northanger Abbey, and I do like how it is like very, very self-conscious about its status as a novel, I suppose. That's quite fun, I think.
Which makes it interesting because I feel like Catherine's sort of flights of fancy are criticised and made fun of.
Yeah.
Even though, like, actually that's the sort of thing that Jane Austen wants.
Yeah, she's got an imagination, which is obviously something Jane Austen must value. Yeah. I
think there's some really interesting characters in it. I think probably the leads are a little bit weak.
Yeah.
But they're not actively objectionable, like in Mansfield Park.
I love Fanny Price.
I know you do.
She's just great. But anyway, yeah, I think that is sort of similar to my feelings about Northanger Abbey. It's quite a lot lower down my Jane Austen ranking, as it were. But I think Northanger Abbey is really funny. I really like the parody elements in it. I think some of the minor characters, especially the Thorpes, are amazing. But I find Catherine Morland and Henry Tilney just like less exciting than every other lead character in Jane Austen, which is why it is my least favourite Jane Austen book. But I do still really love it because I love everything Jane Austen wrote.
Yeah. I mean, Catherine is sort of naive to the point of stupidity on quite a few occasions, and basically the only time Henry Tilney expresses an opinion on anything is to say that women are all stupid.
Yeah, I really don't like Henry Tilney. That's my main objection.
Was mainly maybe less of a problem in the late 18th century.
Yeah, is he joking? Is he not? Do we know?
It's like a pre-internet irony statement.
Yeah. I think Henry Tilney's wit, is funny, but can be a bit mean, which is one of the reasons why I don't love Henry Tilney. As I was telling you earlier, I have a theory that Catherine Morland and Henry Tilney in like 20 years will be like Mr. and Mrs. Bennet, where he like teases her all the time and she doesn't really understand it, and it's kind of sad. That's my opinion about the future for Catherine Morland and Henry Tilney, but there we go. I think I am rare in feeling that. I think quite a lot of people do like Henry Tilney, but he is just, I don't like him. He annoys me quite a bit.
I think the problem with Henry Tilney is that we only ever see him being sort of a bit witty and mean. And obviously at the end he does defy his father to come and propose to Catherine, but I don't think there's any actual expression of any feeling before that point. And
we sort of see his friendship with his sister a bit, which is nice, but we don't see masses of Eleanor. We don't see masses of Eleanor and Henry together.
Who is your favourite character from Northanger Abbey?
I feel like the Thorpes are the best drawn. I don't know if I want to call them my favourite characters because they're both quite dislikable in some ways. But Isabella and John Thorpe, I think, are not necessarily the most interesting people in Northanger Abbey, but I really like them. I think they are the strongest characters in Northanger Abbey. I think they're really interesting, and I feel like Isabella Thorpe, as one of Jane Austen's kind of like antagonist young women, of which there are several in her books, I feel like Isabella Thorpe is one of my favourites, and I feel like she's a very, very good character. Whereas I feel like the hero and heroine and some of the more major characters in Northanger Abbey hold a bit less interest for me.
Yeah, I am actually going to be unhelpful for the interest levels in this video and completely agree with you. I think John Thorpe is right up there with like her great sort of comic satirical creations like Mr. Collins and stuff. Like, you know, I think there's just some wonderful bits where he just, you know, he's talking about like how great his horses are and stuff, and you know, you absolutely recognise the type of person that she's talking about.
And now they'll be talking about their car.
Sort of sat there in a clapped out old Citroen saying that it does 400 miles an hour and things. Just, you know, we all know people like that, and it's really well drawn. Yeah. I think I really like Isabella Thorpe as well because she is quite satisfyingly, I don't know if catty is quite the right word, but she is quite
manipulative. But it's not just manipulative, is it? She's also like, I don't know.
She's really, I think I really like Isabella Thorpe because she is, in a lot, she's the closest thing the novels have to an antagonist, really. Yeah. But actually, I kind of like her. Yeah. Like, I think she does some very bad things that she shouldn't have done. But actually, the last letter she writes to Catherine, which Catherine and the Tilneys just dismiss as manipulative, and it's clearly got an agenda, but it's also quite sad. Yeah. And I think Jane Austen, maybe subconsciously, maybe not, understood the position a woman like Isabella Thorpe was in, and sort of the pressures on her to achieve particular outcomes. Yeah. And I think it's interesting that there's a lot of criticism heaped on Isabella Thorpe by the other people in the novel, but Captain Tilney, who basically leads her to abandon James Morland, Catherine's brother, as a potential marriage partner, is basically let off with a slap on the wrist. I mean, oh, that was a bit naughty of you, Captain Tilney, but actually, like, what he does is really horrible. Like.
Yeah, and he is also, he's another character I feel like that almost needs more development, because he's basically the rake figure in Northanger Abbey, and there's often a rake figure in Jane Austen, but he's probably like the least well developed of the rake figures.
I think he's the least morally condemned. Like, if you look at someone like Wickham, or even Henry Crawford, who I think Jane Austen has a lot of sympathy for, there's no doubt from the narrative perspective that what they've done or what they're doing is wrong, and it's framed as wrong. Whereas Captain Tilney really is, you know, you could replace Captain Tilney with like Hurricane or Force of Nature. He's just there to reveal Isabella's true nature.
And I think as well, like, Isabella and Catherine's friendship is real, and that doesn't mean that Isabella's a good person, and that doesn't mean that Catherine needs to forgive Isabella for abandoning her brother. But I feel like Isabella does genuinely like Catherine, not enough that she was willing to not pursue what she thought was a more advantageous possibility of marriage, and therefore throw over Catherine's brother. But I do think that, like, she does like Catherine, and yeah, I think I agree that letter she writes is quite sad.
I think for the people in the novel, Isabella is just a sort of social climbing and manipulative monster, whereas actually I think the way I read her is much more as a young woman who knows there's a lot of expectations on her and a lot of pressure. You know, the Thorpes have a lot of children, as do the Morlands, and you know, Pride and Prejudice talks at length about the financial difficulties of having lots of children to settle. Yeah,
the pressure to be a social climber is definitely something that Jane Austen is aware of.
Yeah. And I think actually Isabella Thorpe, you can read her as just a manipulative, like, backstabbing, self-interested woman, but actually I think she's a woman under a lot of pressure who is almost pretending she knows what she's doing more than she actually does. Yeah. And I don't think she's not thought through the decisions she's made.
Yeah.
And I do think that final letter is quite sad, actually. Yeah. I think my least favourite character was actually probably General Tilney. Just because I feel like I never really got a handle on him, and I feel like and normally when Jane Austen introduces a character, you really get a sense of who they are, and I don't feel I ever really got a grip on General Tilney. Yeah,
and he should be the tyrannical parent figure. He should be not a Lady Catherine, but in that ilk, but he isn't really, because I don't think he is developed as much.
No, and I think actually the scene at the end where Catherine is thrown out of Northanger Abbey effectively by General Tilney would have been a lot more powerful if we'd sort of had a more consistent sense of
Yeah.
who General Tilney was. And I do think a lot of that gets obscured in the Gothic parody about whether he killed his wife or not. And I just don't think... I think that got in the way of really getting to the heart of General Tilney's character. And I think the other weak link there is actually Eleanor Tilney, who is another character I think could have done with quite a lot more development. Because I think, like you said, we just don't really get anything from her.
No, I don't think we know her so well. And I do think, like, Northanger Abbey is really, really funny, but I do think sometimes more time is spent on being funny than, like, developing the characters, so I don't feel like... Whereas, like, Pride and Prejudice is absolutely hilarious, but also all the characters feel really real, in a way where I feel like Northanger Abbey is very, very funny, and the writing is excellent, and it's very witty, but I feel like the characters themselves aren't quite so fully fledged as in most of her other books. I suppose Northanger Abbey is a bit of a coming-of-age story, which is something I quite like about it. Like, I do feel like it's about Catherine having, like, lots of big experiences for the first time and, you know, going away from home for the first time. She's on her own with adults rather than all her siblings being there for the first time. She falls in love for the first time. You know, she goes to stay with... at Northanger Abbey, like, with friends that she's made on her own for the first time. And I think definitely her arc is kind of coming of age and realising that sometimes her imagination gets away from her. That's something I really like about Northanger Abbey. I suppose that's probably the most...
I would agree with you that it is kind of a coming of age story, but I don't actually know if Catherine... Obviously she does sort of get into a bit of trouble for fantasising about the fact that General Tilney murdered his wife, but actually I don't know if by the end of the novel Catherine is really more like mature or less inclined to daydream about Gothic stuff.
And it's complicated, isn't it? Because obviously she's wrong and she's made a mistake and he didn't kill his wife, but actually he isn't a great person and she did know that and she did see that. So yes, she learns that her imagination can get away from her, but actually, like, she wasn't wrong in essentials about General Tilney. So actually, does she really learn, or does she need to learn within the context of the novel? I don't know.
Yeah. It almost feels like Jane Austen wrote a novel entirely about Lydia Bennet or Harriet Smith. But there's not really any character growth, I don't think. You know, Catherine's a bit naive, but ultimately a good person at the beginning, and she's a bit naive, but ultimately a good person at the end.
I think she's a little bit less naive at the end, but I'm not sure that she's very much less naive. And obviously she does learn that her judgment of Isabella was wrong, I suppose. That is one judgment she learns she didn't get right.
I think the other thing I would say is that she learns she's wrong twice.
Yeah.
She's wrong to put her trust in the Thorpes. And she's wrong to fantasise about the fact that General Tilney is a Gothic villain.
Yeah.
But she never really acts on any of it. There's no moment where she makes a decision because she's learnt that.
Yeah.
I think the closest thing you can get, and like, because Mr. Thorpe just routinely lies to her.
Yeah.
And like the fourth or fifth time, she's like, maybe I won't trust Mr. Thorpe completely.
Yeah.
And that's about the closest thing to a like progression.
I don't know, I do think when she goes home in disgrace, she does feel ashamed of her behaviour, like, to General Tilney and the way she thought about him. No, you've read it much more recently than me. I haven't read it for 3 years, so...
No, I don't think she does, really. I think she sort of thinks that she can't possibly imagine why General Tilney has thrown her out. The only thing she can think of is that, you know, he's somehow discovered that she thought this thing, but then she's like, there's no way he could have found out about that because it's only me and Henry know, and Henry wouldn't have told him. And I don't think she really feels ashamed of it. And also, right at the end, she basically says, well, maybe he didn't murder his wife, but like he could have done. Like,
yeah, I don't know. I do think that drawing a parallel between her and Harriet Smith is quite apt, because I do think actually her and Harriet Smith have quite a lot in common. Which is kind of interesting because obviously Harriet is very much not the heroine of Emma. But I do think they're quite similar in some ways.
Yeah, I mean she's not as for want of a better word silly as Lydia Bennet, but she I think is that sort of
Nor
character.
is she as bold as Lydia Bennet, I would say.
No.
Yeah.
She'd never elope with someone.
No,
like, she's got more of a sense of propriety.
Yeah. But also less of a sense of daring. Like, I just think she wouldn't dare. But I think her and Harriet Smith probably do have quite a lot in common.
And I think we were saying before, it's quite interesting because right at the end, I mean, basically the Deus Ex Machina that actually solves everything is that Eleanor Tilney, who we don't really see, gets married to someone rich.
Yeah.
So General Tilney doesn't care as much about making a wonderful connection for his son. I think what I said before is like watching Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead. And without having Hamlet, I feel like we're seeing a retelling of the novel focusing on Catherine Morland.
Yeah, like there's a big love story for Eleanor that we just don't see, which could be fascinating.
Yeah, I actually think a version of Northanger Abbey focused on Eleanor Tilney with Catherine Morland as a sub-character would be really interesting.
There's probably a retelling out there somewhere.
I'm sure there is, but it almost feels like this should be the retelling, and that's the story that would have been more compelling.
I would like to know more about Eleanor as a character, and I do feel like that is a subplot which is a very quiet subplot, whereas I feel like in other Jane Austen novels the subplot has a lot more space and development, such as in Emma. So it would be interesting to know if Jane Austen had lived longer, would she have gone back to it, would she have revised it, would she have added more? I don't know.
My only other thought, and having said that I enjoyed this more than everything except Pride and Prejudice, I think it's a really fun novel to read. It's very enjoyable. It's a little bit different. If you've read other bits of Jane Austen, it's quite refreshingly different. I think it's probably less refined. And I also think it's interesting that of the books we've talked about on this channel, we've had the least to say about Northanger Abbey.
Yeah. I do think it's a simpler story in some ways than others. Like I know you said you like it more than Mansfield Park, but like Mansfield Park is a much more fascinating book. Like Mansfield Park is so deep and rich and odd, and like there's so much in Mansfield Park to pick apart. Whereas I feel like Northanger Abbey, there's less to pick apart. Like actually, I feel like Northanger Abbey is one where when I first read it, I did really like it, and I do still like it, but I feel like with every other Jane Austen novel, every time I reread it, I love it more, whereas I feel like with Northanger Abbey, every time I reread it, I like it slightly less, because I just don't feel like I have as much to say about it, or as much to think about it, or as much to reassess about it as I do with the rest.
Mansfield Park is bad in interesting ways.
Mansfield Park is wonderful in wonderfully interesting ways.
I don't actually think that Mansfield Park is bad.
No, Mansfield Park is good, isn't it? And you know that it is.
I say that there will be less to get out of this on a reread, definitely.
Yeah. What Jane Austen are you going to read next then? What are you going to read next year?
I don't know, there's only two left, aren't there?
Sense, Sensibility and Persuasion you've got left. You have read Lady Susan as well, which I don't think you mentioned earlier, but obviously that's a bit different.
It's not a proper one.
It is a proper one! I claim it as a proper one. It's wonderful, I love it. So yes, Persuasion and Sense, Sensibility you've got left.
You have to tune in next July to find out.
Yeah.
Definitely, I would recommend reading it if you are interested in Jane Austen, if you'd like something a bit different. But maybe it's not the most complex one she wrote.
I think that's all for now. So thanks very much for watching. Let us know your thoughts down in the comments. Do you love Northanger Abbey? Do you like it less than other Jane Austen books? And that's all for now. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.
Happy Jane Austen July.
That's not how what videos end.
Of the books that I've read, which are Pride and Prejudice, Persuasion... No, I haven't read Persuasion, that's a lie. All Jane Austen is a 5-star read. All Jane Austen is a 5-star read.